Hello, everyone. My name is Clancy Gates, and I'm a rising senior at UD. I major in English and have my minor in environmental humanities. Today, I'm going to be presenting the research project I've been working on this summer, which is called Affect and Environment, an analysis of emotional language in climate change writing. So, the guiding research question for my project is this: how do authors of books about climate change use affect in their writing? And I'll get a little bit more into what that specifically means on the next slide. But first, I want to present a few sub-questions. Mainly, how does a reader process and experience affect in climate change writing? And how can this knowledge be used to advance the field of climate change writing? People obviously have some reaction when they read emotional language, but how can writers use that to their benefit to increase awareness? To be clear here, I've defined climate change writing as nonfiction books that are specifically about climate change, since those are the subject of my study. To clarify right off the bat, affect itself is essentially emotion. We've all read fiction books and recognized the inherent emotion when a character loses a loved one or has their first kiss or whatever it may be. But when you look closely, you're going to find some degree of emotional language in basically any text, whether that's explicit or subtextual. Climate change is usually considered a science issue, and because of that, we usually only talk about it in terms of data and numbers. So we may not think that writing about climate change is going to contain a ton of affect, but it does, and it can be pretty impactful. The overall goal of my research is to identify and analyze the emotional language in books about climate change, and eventually create a database where people can search for the emotional language present in these books. It's also important to ask just what's the point? Studying affect in this writing is going to take a lot of work, so it better be worth it. Thankfully, I think it really is. First of all, it's very difficult to find any research in this field. There's a lot of academic writing about the data in different climate science articles, but affect studies and literature tend to be very theoretical and not too useful for collecting the empirical data I want about emotional language, so I'm trying to fill a gap. But also, the data I collect, I think, will be useful in and of itself. First, it'll paint a picture of how affect is used in climate change writing across authors and subgenres, which is very useful to understanding the field. But beyond that, if we can understand how affect is used in, for example, the most popular books about climate change, authors can use that data to inform their future writing and create climate change writing that may reach more audiences or inspire more change. But to collect any of this data and make it into something useful, I needed to set up frames that would allow me to group usages of emotional language into broader categories to communicate the overall emotion of a given passage. To do this, I decided to use the work of a psychologist named Sylvan Tompkins as the base for these frames, since he spent most of his career trying to do a similar thing, define emotions into distinct categories. Now, he studied how these frames presented themselves physiologically. He actually looked at the faces that babies made when they experienced different stimuli to create these, which obviously doesn't seem like a super relevant thing to what I'm doing. But his 9 affects that he came up with are the most complete and comprehensive set of frames I was able to find, and they actually work very well as an exhaustive list of the emotional language present in climate change writing. I found that with the practical setting I'm working in, Tompkins' sort of concrete work was much more helpful than traditional literary studies of affect I looked at, since those all focus on kind of lofty critical theory. So I took Tompkins' original list and simplified it a bit. Mostly I dropped the affect to smell, which was the least relevant to literature. And while reading a few different initial climate change books, I tried to come up with the strongest possible definitions for each frame, so that every time I came across emotional language, I could easily categorize it into one of these frames. These are really just excerpts from the definitions so that they could fit on this slide, but you've got disgust, which is a strong emotional response to something displeasurable, rage, which is generally synonymous with anger, distress, it's a really broad one that can include a range of negative emotions. Surprise is a neutral response to something surprising. Fear, in general, is a negative anticipation of the future. The future part's important. Shame is an emotional response to something that has happened or already happened, and that's negative, obviously. Excitement is a positive emotion about the future, and joy is a positive emotion to something that has happened or is currently happening. So this is part of one of my many spreadsheets I have for this project, where I made lists of words or phrases that signal each of these frames. These are directly out of the first few books I read, but only just from a few books. You can see from these lists that there's a lot of distress and fear, and not so much excitement or joy, which is about what we'd expect to see in books about climate change. Once I had the frame sorted out, the next step was actually selecting which books I would be reading and analyzing. Naturally, I made a giant spreadsheet and put in every book I could find about climate change, wrote a short synopsis, and marked down its availability, year of publication, and user rating on Goodreads. Most of this is just to help categorize the books, but I also plan on cross-checking my findings with the Goodreads rating to get an idea of how audiences react to different appearances of affect. I initially planned on analyzing a much larger number of books this summer, but it took me a long time to create the affect frames and general process I used to analyze books, so it quickly became apparent that I would only be able to get through about 10 books this summer. As I go on, the process of analyzing becomes quicker, but at the time I'm making this presentation, I've only gotten through 5 books. Anyways, to narrow down my list, I used my previous synopses of the books to pick about 20 that seemed the most useful to my research, and then grouped those into categories based on their age, subject matter, and format, and also made note of the profession of each of their authors. The goal here, since I couldn't do as many books as I would have liked to, was to create a sort of survey of the different subgenres contained within climate change literature. I wanted a few books by scientists, a few books by journalists, a few books about the future of climate change, a few books about the debate around climate change, books by climate deniers, and so on, to create a comprehensive list, or as much as possible as I could with only 10 books. The bulk of my project, of course, is the actual analysis of books, and that process looks pretty much like this. I have a spreadsheet for each book, where I copy the relevant passage and make note of what page it's on, which affect frame it fits into, and which word or phrase signals that affect. Just to make that process a little more clear, here's an example passage from an International Journal of Environmental Resources and Public Health article that reviewed something like 2,000 scholarly articles about climate change. There's growing concern about more intense rainfall, fires worsened by heat and drought, a weakening Gulf Stream, and increased sinuosity of the jet stream. This article is pretty dry in emotional language. It mainly offers averages of a lot of statistics and whatnot, but even the driest text is usually going to have some affect present. Here, the word that signals affect is concern. We all probably know what the word concern means, but just to be sure, we can look at the definition and see it means anxiety or worry. The frame it falls into then is pretty clearly fear, and that's because, like my definition of fear states, this passage contains negative emotion regarding things that could happen in the future, like intensifying rainfall and worsening fires. So like I said, I've only gotten through 5 books at this point, which I feel is not nearly enough to have definitive results. I actually decided to eliminate one of the books I read, a collection of speeches by Greta Thunberg, since I felt transcribed speeches didn't fit with the spirit of books about climate change. It wasn't written as a book to be read, but rather as speeches to be heard. But I still wanted to offer some preliminary results in this presentation, just to give a general idea of what the spread of affect looks like in the books I've read so far. So this is a breakdown of the affect in the first book I read, The Uninhabitable Earth, by David Wallace Wells. Wallace Wells is a journalist, and this one started off as an article in New York Magazine before he made it into a full-fledged book. I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but it's essentially about the grim kind of future we're facing if we don't make drastic changes. I describe the tone of this book as straightforward and clinical, which is probably why you're not seeing affects like rage and disgust appear as much as distress and shame, which in general aren't as strong or impassioned. I found 82 total instances of emotional language in this book, though, so it's far from lacking emotion. This book, on the other hand, Climate Change, What Everyone Needs to Know, only had 17 instances of affect that I found over about 250 pages. It's a very scientific look at climate change by a climate scientist that mostly focuses on statistics, but also has some quotes from other scientists. Those quotes are where I found the bulk of the affect in this book, and that might be why fear is the most significant affect, because the subject of this book are personally close to and familiar with the subject. The third book, The Future We Choose, was written by 2 of the authors of the UN's Paris Climate Accord, which was a landmark international agreement to limit temperature change to 2 degrees Celsius that was signed in 2016. The most striking thing on this chart, to me, is the significance of the excitement affect, which is way more present than in any other book I've read so far. This is pretty understandable, though, since the two authors are coming off a pretty huge victory for climate activists. Despite this, the positive emotions, excitement, and joy only make up a third of the affect in the book. The last book I analyzed was The Great Derangement, which was written by Amitav Ghosh, who generally writes novels. This book isn't as much about climate change itself as it is about our failure to grasp the concept of climate change in our literature, history, and politics. An example of this is that if a novel includes an extreme weather event, it tends to automatically be deemed science fiction, even though extreme weather events happen in real life with increasing frequency. As you might expect from a book about a failure to acknowledge climate change, there's a lot of shame present, more than in any of the other books. So shame, along with distress and fear, covers almost all of the affect in this book. And this graph is just a combined breakdown of all the affect I found in all 4 books. Unsurprisingly, the negative affects dominate, accounting for 90% of all emotional language in these 4 books, while joy, excitement, and surprise only make up about 10%. And this isn't a representation of the overall instances of emotional language I found per 100 pages in each book. The outlier is clearly climate change, what everyone needs to know, which was by far the most scientific and least emotionally driven of the texts. Obviously, with only 4 books analyzed so far, there's still a lot of work to be done if I want to make any claims about the field of climate change writing in general. Luckily, I'm doing a senior thesis in the upcoming year where I plan on doing pretty much exactly that, going much more into depth with everything I've done so far and expanding the parameters of my research. The first step, clearly, is going to be to analyze a lot more books from subgenres I haven't looked at yet to get a more comprehensive picture of the field. The most important part of all this is the books themselves, since they're what I'm actually analyzing. When I'm satisfied with the number of books I've analyzed, I want to get more into the fundamentals of effective language and how it's perceived. When a reader comes across affect in text, what happens? How do they experience it, and how is that different from affect in other forms like video or speech? I'm going to need to know that in order to draw broader conclusions about affect and specifically climate change writing and reach the ultimate goal of my research, which is to figure out the best, most effective ways to use emotional language in climate change writing and convince readers of its danger. For all I know, writing may just not be an effective way to do that, but the goal is to figure that out. I'm pretty happy with the process I've set up to analyze books, and I'm excited about the progress I've made so far, as well as for the work I'll be doing next year. I think that my work could potentially be very helpful for authors using affect in their writing about climate change. And these are just the citations for the works I cited in this presentation. Thank you all for watching.